From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the African and Middle East Division of the Library of Congress and to our noontime lecture series with today's program entitled Classified as White, Historical Insights into the Racial Classification of Americans of African and Middle East Descent. I'm Joan Weeks, head of the Near East section and Turkish specialist. On behalf of all my colleagues, in particular Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, Chief of the Division, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. And before we get started, we always like to give you a little overview of the division and the resources in the hopes that you'll come back and use the collections for your research. The division is comprised of 3 sections that build and serve the collections to researchers from around the world. We cover 75 countries and more than 24 languages. The Africa section includes the countries of all sub-Saharan Africa. The Hebraic section is responsible for Judaica and Hebraica worldwide, and the Near East section covers all of the Arab countries, including North Africa, Turkey, Turkic Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, and the Muslims of Western China, Russia, the Balkans, and the peoples of the Caucasus, as well as Armenia. After the program, we'd like to invite you to fill in the evaluation forms we placed in your seats and leave them at the information desk at the front of the reading room as you exit. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Mohamed Salahi, our Arab World Specialist, to the podium to introduce our speaker for today's program. Mohamed?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Our speaker today, Randa Kayali, is a professorial lecturer in anthropology at George Washington University's Elliott School for International Affairs. She received her doctorate from George Mason University in Cultural Studies in 2013 and an MA from American University in Cairo in Sociology Anthropology. Dr. Kayali has taught Arab World Studies at American University in Washington, D.C., and was a postdoctoral research fellow at Ali Vural AK Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University. She published The Arab Americans, Greenwood Press, 2006, which she received a book award from the Arab American National Museum, and was translated into Arabic as Al-Amrikiyun Al-Arab. She is the author of a chapter on family in the edited volume, Daily Life of Arab Americans in the 21st Century, and U.S. Census Classifications of Arab Americans, Contestations and Definitions of Identity Markers in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, published in September of 2013. She currently serves on the board and as treasurer of the Arab American Studies Association and as co-chair of the Tri-Annual Convention. So without further ado, Dr. Randa Kayali.
I'd like to thank Mohamed and the staff here at the Library of Congress, the Africa and Middle East Division, for their kindness in inviting me and welcoming me to this lecture series. I'd also like to thank the Arab American National Museum and Helen Samhan for the images that you will see in this PowerPoint. This piece is a work in progress, so I hope, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session. The classification of Middle Easterners and North Africans in the U.S. as white by race stretches back over a century ago. In light of the possibility that there might be a new Middle Eastern and North African box, a MENA box, and I'll use that acronym throughout my presentation, on the 2020 census form, this historical research has contemporary significance. In today's presentation, we will learn that debates over the MENA racial classifications are not novel, and that a deeper examination of history and critique of the historical narratives offers the contemporary reader 3 noteworthy insights. Firstly, the naturalization rulings in U.S. courts that determine the eligibility of early Menans to U.S. citizenship show that labels of the geographic region and the perceptions of people within them determined race. While they were ultimately classified as white and therefore grouped with Europeans, those with Middle Eastern origins were noted as from Asia in terms of continental assignments, but not ultimately Asiatic or Mongolian by race. Secondly, I will show that the judges in these cases drew a Christian-Muslim binary and placed the premium on their origins in the Mohammedan world, as it was called back then, occasionally noting the Eastern rites of their Christianity and generally grouping Syrian Christians with Islam by culture, even if they were recognized as Christian. Finally, the history of the U.S. Census classifications indicates that Menans have been identified by factors other than race and religion on official forms issued by the U.S. government for over a century, specifically through questions relating to ancestry and language spoken at home. In other words, then as now, there are additional ways to access ethnic identity within a broad white racial classification. So as a bit of background, since 1977, the U.S. government, and particularly the Office of Management and Budget, has classified white as a person, in quotes, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa, end quote. Although geographic boundaries of the MENA region are undefined, I consider the main ethnic groups in MENA to be Iranians, Persians, Turks, and Arabs, but that the region also includes significant numbers of minority ethnic groups, namely the Amazigh, the Kurds, and Armenians, as well as ethno-religious groups including Chaldeans, Assyrians, Syriacs, Maronites, Copts, and Jews. And often language is tied to each one of these collectivities. This presentation will focus on how people from all of these groups from the MENA region came to be classified by the US government in official records before World War II. Racially, they were classified as white in two batches of legal cases. The first set by Syrian Christians between 1909 and 1915, and the second set by Muslim Arabians, these are terms that were used in these cases, in 1942 and 44. Through an examination of immigration categories, census questions, and racial prerequisite cases, legal cases, I will strive to highlight how geography, race, and religion were in fact intertwined and provide insights into how mainstream American society viewed MENA Americans as between white and non-white. So I wanted to ask you, as the audience, if there was ever a time you've been mistaken for a member of an ethnic, religious, or national group that you did not belong to, and how did that make you feel? If you felt that it was a compliment and positive mistaken identity, put up your hands. Okay, nice, 3. And if you felt that it was something that hurt you or was negative, put up your hands. Oh, okay, so about even. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Ooh, sorry. Okay. So in the first sort of phase of immigration, you had the Philadelphia, there were men from North Africa who traveled or were brought to the U.S. as slaves. The Philadelphia World's Fair of 1876 brought people and delegations from the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and Tunisia to showcase their countries. The Ottoman exhibit heavily featured Palestinian Christians from Bethlehem and Jerusalem who were marketed as being from the Bible land or the Holy Land, with shepherds herding the flocks and images that recalled the Arabian Nights fables. They sold religious items such as olive wood crucifixes from Bethlehem, rosary beads, and mother-of-pearl decorative items. This was part of the Ottoman Empire's strategy to show the world that they treated their religious minorities with respect. And yet there are media reports, US media reports, of surprise that there were Christians who were Ottoman Turkish subjects, because Arabs and Turks were perceived in the US to be followers of Muhammad. Some of these merchants stayed on, such as Joseph Abi Mader, who was recorded in the 1880 census as living in Philadelphia. So usually, I'm just going to cite 5 reasons that are cited for the onset of the first phase of immigration, which began in 1880, or about there. It's not an exact cutoff date, of course, but and that these immigrants came from Bilad Sham, or Syria, an Ottoman province that encompassed present-day Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and parts of Jordan, and they came to the U.S. The fair had prompted stories of wealth and success to be had from selling goods to Americans and offered the lure of adventure. Combined with the economic downturn of the economy due to the collapse of silk factories, or sericulture, on Mount Lebanon, the financial incentives of living and earning money in the U.S. for a few years were strong. An argument I find compelling is the influence of the Christian missionaries from the U.S. establishing and teaching schools in the region. Also cited, but in my opinion less likely due to the dates, is the sectarian violence, particularly the Druze-Maronite clashes on Mount Lebanon and the riots in Damascus. However, the deterioration of the Ottoman Empire and the conscription of young Christian and Jewish men into the army required in 1909 by the Ottoman Empire were significant factors in the choice of young men to move continents. So I'm going to come back to the issue of millets. Okay, this is a picture of the Zaina family from Damascus, and this is when they were still in Damascus. I believe that they're possibly Orthodox Rum or Rum Catholic Melkites. From their dress, they were definitely urban and probably elite. A little background, though, I want to give you on the Ottoman Empire. In 1516, the Ottoman empires invaded Bilad Sham and continued to rule almost continuously until World War I. The Ottoman Empire gave Sunni Muslims a primary place as socially and culturally superior to the other communities in the empire. In the 19th century, the state solidified legal and socio-political structures for non-Muslims. In these millets, which I mentioned on the last slide, Christian and Jewish subjects were permitted to regulate their own communities and given some autonomy in terms of family laws, taxation, and collective representation. The largest Christian millet in the 18th and 19th century in the Syrian province was the Orthodox Christian, or Rum, millet. You write it in English as R-U-M. According to their own ecclesiastical structures, these Orthodox Christians fell under 2 patriarchates. The larger Greek-dominated patriarchate, or C, of Constantinople, and the smaller Arabic-speaking patriarchate of Antioch that was headquartered in Damascus and had the areas now known as Lebanon and Syria under its jurisdiction. In 1848, the empire gave Greek Catholics, called Rum Catholic in Arabic, who were in union with the Roman Catholic Church, a millet of their own. These Greek Catholics, which despite the name were explicitly Arabic-speaking in services, as well as colloquially, were also known as Melkites, or kingsmen, so named for their loyalty to the Byzantine emperors. Roman Catholics, who were not part of the Melkite Church, and Protestants were granted extraordinary status as protected foreigners, and Maronites and other Latin rites were dealt with at the level of the local provincial administrations. This patchwork of treatment gave religious minorities in the Ottoman Empire a degree of religious freedom, but they were also required to submit to Ottoman demands and the Islamic character of the state or empire. This is the backdrop against which many of the immigrants arrived in the U.S. and perceived identity. The Ottoman millet and decentralized system ingrained identity as defined by religion, broadly Christian, Jewish, Muslim, and noted the differences between religious sects for Christians, Rum Catholic, Roman Catholic, Protestant, and Maronite, for example. And that underlined which areas and sects were answerable to which patriarchs, to which religious figures, to which rabbis. Whether or not the existence of millets created the violence and discrimination against Christians in Mount Lebanon or the riots in the city of Damascus in the late 19th century became less important for the immigrants upon their arrival in their new countries in South and North America than the fact that they had come from the Ottoman Empire. So, going back to my question, the migrants from Bilad Sham were recorded as Ottoman or from Turkey and Asia, and sometimes from Palestine or Syria in official immigration records in the US, until the end of the Ottoman Empire officially dissolved in 1923. Religion was not recorded, and so estimates of religious breakdowns of the Syrian migrants are problematic. But we can assume that many of the non-Turkish Ottoman subjects might object to classification as Ottoman, because Ottoman was seen as synonymous with Turkish, which was ethnically and linguistically differentiated from Arabic speakers. Back home, these immigrants had informally used the term Turk to refer to Muslims, and in the US, Turk and even Syrian connoted an Islamic identification. This popular assumption in the US in the early 19th century was well-founded, was well illustrated by a pulp fiction story that appeared in the American magazine in 1912 that I found nestled in the NAF archives at the Smithsonian. In the story, Emily, a curious young farm girl, asks the self-described peddler from Syria, aren't they Mohammedans, your people? And when he explains that his mother belonged to the Greek church, but that he was Presbyterian, Emily was incredulous. Emily was impressed with how exotic this peddler was, different from her family in every way because of his background in a far-off land. Even if he was Christian, he seemed Mohammedan. Today, of course, we would not use the term Mohammedan because Muslims don't worship Muhammad, but back then it was sort of standard practice. The blurring of the East with Islam follows a traditional Orientalist binary that posits the Orient as defined in opposition to the Occident and Western Christianity. In his critique of Orientalism, Edward Said pointed out that those Orientalist scholars, such as Massignon, saw Eastern Christians as subsumed within Islam and as part of a monolithic East, which had Islam as the superstructure. At a time when the US was increasingly xenophobic, this association with the Islamic other was particularly problematic, especially for immigrants from the East who wanted to gain material and social status in the US. Alixa Naff authored a seminal history book called Becoming American, the Early Arab Experience, and it was published in 1985. And it truly began a deeper interest in the history of the Syrians in particular, but Arabs in general. Though her book and large collection that is housed at the Smithsonian, she initiated a dominant narrative of the early experience, as she called it, meaning before World War II. Within Arab American studies, there is a dominant historical narrative of the poor, illiterate farmer from a village in Mount Lebanon or Syria who came to the US, first arriving in New York at Ellis Island, and then staying or living for a few days, or possibly longer, in what was called the Mother Colony, which was the Syrian colony that existed at the tip of Manhattan. And then that traveler would possibly travel by train to meet family members or friends and start peddling with the goods that he bought, because most of this discourse is for single men, with the goods in New York. This photo of a pack peddler is somewhat iconic to that narrative. Naff estimated that as much as 95% of the immigrants from Syria were Christian before World War II, while another historian calculated that nearly 90% of all Arabic-speaking immigrants arriving in the US before 1924 were Syrian Christians from Mount Lebanon. According to these historians, the Arabic-speaking immigrants to the US would have been Christian, with a minority of Druze and Sunni Muslims. This is a young fellow that is an example that the dominant narrative does contain some truths in my mind. Tawfiq here was all of those things. He was a single male who immigrated in 1914 was a Maronite Christian from a village in Mount Lebanon, Bakhtuta, east of Beirut. He was a farmer in that village and was unschooled, probably illiterate, and became a laborer and a peddler in the U.S., where he changed his name by adding Ellis after his father Elias. In 1919, he opened a cigar store with his uncle and later produced arak, an aniseed-flavored spirit, during Prohibition. In 1925, Tawfiq returned to Lebanon to fetch a bride, returning to the U.S. a year later, where he and his wife had his family and lived out the rest of their days. This photo may represent the marginalized narrative of early Arab American history. There's a dearth of information or even ongoing research regarding Egyptian, Iranian, Yemeni, and North African immigrants. This photo shows an allegiance to the Ottoman Empire through the fezes, which are the hats that are shaped like a cone, and the star and crescent on what looks like, to me, a water pipe or possibly a decorative silver or brass vase. It's at the top of the vase, you can see the star. These were possibly Egyptians, possibly Muslim, and the alternative discourse, I believe, needs to be further researched. Who were these immigrants? How did they fit in or differ from the narratives on the Syrians? Why did their race never come up in legal cases until the end, where you do hear Yemeni debates on the Yemeni? However, Syrian identity was recognized in the U.S. Census. In the 1900, 1910, and 1920 censuses, Syrian were a recognized group within the population statistics of foreign-born whites. In the 1910 and 1920 censuses, Syria was listed as a separate birthplace, even though it was still officially part of the Ottoman Empire. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, being associated with the Ottoman Empire became more of a political problem rather than just an identification issue, because the U.S. sided with the Allies against the Axis powers, including the Ottoman Empire. This solidified a move away from associations with the Ottoman Empire for the Syrians, a shift in identity supported and recognized by the U.S. Census Bureau. By 1930, the census, the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, and new country of birth appellations became necessary. The Census Bureau asked its census takers, or enumerators, to record the country of birth according to present geopolitical locations. In 1930, this is, specifically mentioning, as you can see, the list up there. This indicates to the researcher that there were other types of Menans present in the U.S. and that the Census Bureau was also recognizing. And another way that Syrians were recognized was through language spoken at home, which was recorded. And then the 1910 census asked, can the person speak English? If not, what language does the person speak? And both Syrian and Turkish were listed as principal foreign languages spoken in the U.S., but not Arabic. I don't know the reason for that, but that's something that's interesting. And yet, in 1920, the options on the respondent's mother tongue expanded to include Arabic, and then, and again, in 1930, the options included Egyptian. So in 1930, they had Syrian, Arabic, and Egyptian. However, the Syrian community was not monolithic, even if we just take it as Syrian. An academic, Philip Corey Hitti, published a study in 1924 on Syrians in America that found that most were Christian. Most numerous among the Syrians were the Maronites, followed by the Orthodox and Greek Catholics, Melkites, and then Protestants. While these churches indicated a healthy community, the divisions between sects and nations were becoming increasingly prevalent. New countries were being established under colonial powers by the 1920s, divided between British and French colonial authorities. Coming back to the US, in 1910, the census enumerators were instructed to note down their nativity. And if the respondent said that their parents' nativity was in Turkey, they were asked to note the Asia part. Although the Syrian province is located in Asia, they did not want to be considered Asian due to the prevalent Asian exclusion and restrictions, which were well known. Until 1909, Minaans had assumed the privileges of whiteness. They were granted citizenship without much deliberation. They held political offices, and they owned property, even in states where property ownership by aliens was prohibited. The naturalization era began with this, I'm moving, but I'll come back to this topic. The naturalization era began with the 1790 Naturalization Act, which stipulated that only free white persons could become U.S. citizens. The racial designation as white became a prerequisite for naturalization and for full rights as a U.S. citizen. The question then became who qualified to be a free white person, and this decision was determined by the courts, and in particular by judges. Armenians, Mexicans, Indians, and Sikhs all faced racial prerequisite cases between 1909 and 1923. But 1 in 3 racial prerequisite cases heard in the U.S. federal courts were of Syrians. Obviously, this number far exceeds the percentage of Syrians or even Minaans in the U.S. population, indicating that the racial ascription of Syrians was in question, legally and perhaps socially at the time. After the Syrian Christians' white racial ascription had been finally determined in 1915, and I'm going to go over these, in overturning the case of George Dow, other cases popped up in the 1940s. These were of 2 men who were Muslim, one a Yemeni man whose petition for naturalization was rejected, and one of a Saudi whose petition to be naturalized as a U.S. was permitted. At issue in these cases was not just race and religion, as we will discover. According to Ian Haney Lopez, a critical race and legal scholar, there are 4 main types of arguments for and against determining whether the Syrians were white: scientific evidence, congressional intent, common knowledge, and legal precedent. The scientific evidence claims were rooted in racial development theories that examine the biological origins of the human and white race. Judges deliberated over and weighed arguments over the differences between white and Caucasian. And in the case of Najjour and Modari, Syrians were found to be Semites. Semites were Caucasian, and Caucasians were white. In the congressional intent arguments, the intent of the authors of the Naturalization Act were examined. Since most free white persons in 1790 were European, the question revolved around whether Syrians were qualified to be free white persons as Congress had intended, or whether common knowledge of today dictated that the Syrians were or were not white. I will argue that there were more significant factors in determining the race of the Syrians and later the Arabians. Primary among these was a choice, a strategy, to distance themselves from Asianness, even though Syria was technically located in Western Asia, and to place their origins closer to Europe. The mental geography of this choice was a key in establishing their legal claims to whiteness. For the Syrians, there was also a distancing from traits associated with Islam that were believed at the time to be unassimilable into the American polity, namely polygamy and a democratic mind. So there were alternative framings for racial determinations in my analysis. In 1909, George Shisham, a policeman in Venice, California, arrested a young man for disturbing the peace. The young man's father, a prominent lawyer, challenged Shisham's right to arrest his son on the basis that Shisham was not and could not be a U.S. citizen. Although Shisham had lived in California for about 20 years, his naturalization was in question due to his origins in the Ottoman Empire's lands called Turkey in Asia. Friends pooled their resources and hired a lawyer, Byron Hanna, a fellow countryman, to defend Shisham. As part of their case, they wrote to academics in universities to inquire about the ethnological background of their ancestry and argued that Syrians were Caucasian. In the final court hearing, Shisham declared to the judge, and I do love this quote, "If I am Mongolian, then so was Jesus, because we came from the same land." In fact, the way in which Shisham articulated his origins claimed a more authentic Christianity, rooted in the land of the Bible, a Christianity that was more authentic than the judge's presumed Christianity as a Protestant. This line of reasoning dovetailed with the racial ideology in the U.S. that had hallmarked Jesus as white at the time. The judge dismissed religion as a factor that determined race, but Shisham's declaration convinced the judge that he was not Asian, and he ruled that Shisham was white and therefore eligible for citizenship. After the decision was read, George Shisham took his oath of allegiance to the United States before he left the court. Despite this ruling, the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization continued to deny some Syrian Americans U.S. citizenship and naturalization, therefore. Many of the legal arguments in the early cases regarding the race of Arab Americans centered on being from the Holy Land and a practicing Christian of good morals, sober, and industrious. There's many legal cases about this. By indicating to the court that they were Christians, early Arab Americans were distancing themselves from Islam. This was a strategy based on the negative image of Islam in the eyes of immigration specialists and judges who were particularly concerned with the polygamy and its associative immorality. In these cases, polygamy was associated with Muslim and was considered unassimilable. In fact, some Syrians had been turned away at Ellis Islands and other ports of entry because they were Muslim and therefore potentially polygamist, regardless of whether or not they were married. There's a story of a 15-year-old boy who was turned away because he was Muslim, because he could become polygamist. These laws were originally put on the books actually to exclude Mormons, not Muslims, in another note. In some ways, I agree with the legal scholar Khaled Beydoun that there were clear cognitive links made in these cases. He argues Muslims were presumed to be non-white, and Arabs were presumed to be Muslims. Arabs were presumptively ineligible for citizenship. There was a conflation of Arab and Muslim, a conflation that persists today despite many efforts at educating the public at large. In the 1910s, these petitioners, Syrian Christians, all of them, did invoke their religion to secure citizenship, but they were often believed to not be real Christians by the judges. This was due to the presumption that every immigrant from the Arab world was Muslim, as Beydoun argues. However, I maintain that religion was not the legal proxy for race. Culture was. The perceived culture of the immigrants and the perceived culture of America in which the immigrants were determined to be assimilable or not assimilable. These Christians, Eastern Christians, if I may, were presumed to be culturally Muslim. They had come from an Islamic empire and had customs similar to their neighbors who were and are today Muslim. They were not considered to be religio-culturally American in their Christianity. Many of the Christians followed Eastern rites and liturgies in their services, forms of worship that were unfamiliar to Americans accustomed to Latin rite, Roman Catholic services, or English language Protestant churches. Occasionally, as in the case of Ellis, the petitioner's sect were referred to by the judges, Ellis was Maronite, even when they determined that religion was not a factor in the ruling. These cases persisted in coming up. Costa-Najor and Ellis were ruled to be white and were naturalized, until, in 1913, Firas Shahid was denied naturalization. After all these legal precedents by fellow Syrians, Syrian Christian countrymen, why was Shahid's petition for naturalization denied? Although the judge does state in his ruling that he was a Christian and that he is coming from the very cradle of the Jewish and Christian religions, his origins were in Zahli, in Asia Minor in Syria, and he uses the term Asia Minor here, and Syria. And the judge noted, he writes his name in Arabic but cannot read or write English. Most significantly, he is accused of potentially being a polygamist and a disbeliever in organized government, because it seems he could not understand the questions which were posed in English. This is my assessment. These last 2 points are substitutes for claiming that he is Muslim by culture. Polygamy and a lack of democratic mind were 2 reasons that Muslims were turned away from Ellis Island. The judge even asks and answers, what is the race or color of the modern inhabitant of Syria? It is impossible to say. But then the judge reasoned that complex history and the Arabian Mohammedan eruption, and I'm not sure what he means by that, has meant that the race of Syrians is inconclusive. He wrote, one Syrian may be of pure or almost pure Jewish, Turkish, or Greek blood, and another the pure-blooded descendant of an Egyptian, an Abyssinian, or a Sudanese. Presumably, the former grouping would be considered white, and the latter non-white. Flummoxed, the judge rejected Shahid's application based on his own personal disqualifications, which I interpret to mean his illiteracy, but also his inability to deny cultural traits associated with Islam in English. Now, the final case was George Dow. He was rejected for naturalization twice, and then the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals was granted citizenship. In the first 2 petitions, Judge Smith stated that although Dow was Maronite, a Christian, religion should not be the basis for race. His petition was denied by Judge Smith twice because he was Asiatic and therefore not white, and so not eligible for U.S. citizenship. This geographic, continental even, association was the focus of the appeal case and the ruling that overturned Dow and stopped the questioning of the Syrians' whiteness. In Dow versus United States in 1915, the judge ruled certain Asiatics near the Mediterranean Sea, including Syrians, were generally classed as white people. Their physical attributes tipped the scale on not being Asian. Listen to the judge's reasoning in this case. Physically, the modern Syrians are of mixed Syrian, Arabian, and even Jewish blood. They belong to the Semitic branch of the Caucasian race, thus widely differing from their rulers, the Turks, who are in origin Mongolian. The Syrians did not look Asian, and so were not classified as Asian. And this is in the American mind, right? And were therefore considered white by default. It's as if white was the leftover bucket category when one deducted Black, Native American, and Asian. The sheer number of cases in proportion to their population in the US indicates that Syrian whiteness was not a slam dunk race categorization. This was highlighted once again in the second set of cases that I mentioned in the introduction in 1942, when a Yemeni man petitioned for his right to naturalize and become a US citizen and was rejected. Again, while his religion was not on trial per se, his geographic religious origins were. Listen closely again to the judge's words. Apart from the dark skin of the Arabs, so this phenotypical association here, apart from the dark skin of the Arabs, it was well known that they are part of the Mohammedan world and that a wide gulf separates their culture from that of the predominantly Christian peoples of Europe. It was a cultural and civilizational divide that made Ahmed Hassan of Detroit, Michigan, non-white. The judge wrote, the court finds that the petitioner is an Arab and that Arabs are not white persons within the meaning of the act. Not only are Arab, Muslim, and non-white intertwined in this ruling, but also the binary of Christian West and Islamic East looms large. The ruling was overturned when a Saudi man, Mohammed Mohriz, was granted naturalization in 1944. The judge wrote, the Arab passes muster as a white person, and reflected that the rigid exclusion of persons of Chinese nationality and of the yellow race, and this is his term, went against our vital interest as a world power and of a democratic liberalism. It was clear from the racial ruling in this case, which cemented all peoples from MENA as white, that global politics played a role, and that specifically there was a desire, and this is in the ruling, to promote friendlier relations between the United States and other nations, specifically Saudi Arabia in this case in the early 40s. Just prior to that moment in 1933, the Arabian American Oil Company now had brought together the U.S. and Saudi interests in drilling for oil in the Arabian Peninsula. The fact that there were racial prerequisite cases for MENAs until 1944 indicates that the racial classification, almost to the end of the naturalization era in 1952, were significant. In 1952, the Immigration and Naturalization Act was passed, thus ending the naturalization era. This presentation works towards answering why and how the Syrians and later Arabians came to be white by race in the 1977 OMB ruling. The placement of MENAs in the ordering of races and their associative geographies was complicated and contested in the naturalization era. At the turn of the century, they were considered as from Turkey and Asia, or Asia, Turkey in brackets Asia, through the court cases, they were determined not to be Asiatic or Mongolian. This led them away from the constraints of Asian exclusion laws, but towards the appellation of a province, Syria, that would shortly break up into colonial states with the end of the Ottoman Empire. Later, this would be regrouped into a new geographic label, Middle East and North Africa, and was included with Europeans in the broad white racial category. Religion and race are not always intertwined in reality. Immigrants and their descendants from the region have been characterized by Islamic culture or civilization. Historically, the majority of these immigrants were Christian, and there continues to be large percentages of Christians in the immigrant populations from Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine. I estimate that approximately half, or possibly more, of the MENA population in the U.S. today is Christian. This includes many Christian groups, including Chaldeans, Assyrians, Maronites, Orthodox, and others. The historical and ongoing conflation of Arab and Muslim, and MENA and Muslim, is inaccurate, and perhaps especially in the U.S. If there is a MENA category in the 2020 census, care must be taken not to typify this category as Muslim. While population figures on religious identity are not tabulated by federal agencies, official classifications have historically, and continue to, count more than race for MENA Americans. While nativity is no longer collected by the census, national origins are tabulated in naturalization statistics. The American Communities Survey, administered annually by the U.S. Census Bureau, tabulates both language spoken at home and ancestry. These indicators are important to better understand the needs of the MENA populations and remain ways in which identity is alternatively formed through subnational groupings and even colloquial dialects that are increasingly written in fiction and in literature more. These changes, however, are not new, and many of these lessons can be learned from historical research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Randa. We now have a few minutes for a question and answer. Just a quick note to the audience, this program is being recorded, so while we encourage your participation, by asking questions, you are consenting to you having your voice recorded and later webcast.
I hope it was scintillating. Yes. I'm not sure if I can answer it. So the question was, in 1977, what was the situation with the Census Bureau before that? And then why was why was race classified that way. I mean, my whole talk is sort of preparing us to understand why in 1977 it was included like that. There was that shift by the Syrians at first, and then even in the later cases as well, to classify Middle East and North Africans, with white, with Europeans. And I think that was a strategy, right? I'm not sure how the Census Bureau calculated it before. I know in 1960 it turned to self-enumeration, so you didn't have an enumerator unless you didn't fill it out. Come by and like fill it out for you, which you did before 1960. So there was a switch in terms of empowering people to answer how they self-identified. And I believe in 1970, it was still the case that Syrians or Minans were classified as white, because in the 1910 census they were classified as foreign-born white. So I would assume that in 1970 that was true as well. But as I argue in this paper, there's other ways in which ethnicity is accessed, right? So through ancestry questions, language spoken at home. Yes? Okay, the first question is, what were the numbers in this period that we're looking at? And this is really the only piece that we really have that I put up on the screen in terms of the numbers. There are some estimates that think this is a little bit wrong, and it's about 220,000 in the 1920s, but that's about it. So in 1924, there was a law passed that restricted immigration, so that these numbers, the Syrians were given quotas. It's a longer story. And so only 100 were allowed to come in per year if it wasn't a family reunification issue. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't more, because there were people that were able to sponsor other family members through family reunification. But in terms of new immigrants, only 100 a year after 1924. So this number wouldn't have grown exponentially. So I would say about 220,000. In terms of your question about how did the English and French categorize immigrants, I'm not sure if they really calculated that there were immigrants with an E, right, from the colonial territories that they administered. So in particular, France had control over Lebanon and Syria. And the British had control over Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan, as they were called, or Transjordan. I'm not sure what they would have calculated, but they definitely would have preferred probably for people not to leave. So they may not have made those figures official. But that's something that I could research a bit more. Thank you, Dominique. Yes, Mary Jane.
My question is the issue of religion
Mm-hmm.
in the classification. Okay, so they had Mohammedan and Christians, but did that apply to other areas? For example, Protestants and Catholics from Europe. Was that ever an issue? It was an issue, for example, in elections. When Kennedy was elected, it was a big issue that he happened to be Catholic. Was that an issue with Asians coming? Whether they were Buddhist or Confucianist or Christian or Jewish or Muslim, was religion an issue outside of the MENA region? This is what I'm saying. So when
I think
the accepted people, was religion an issue?
So the question is, was religion an issue for non-MENAN peoples? And the answer would be yes. In total. It depended on what religion we were talking about, but religion was pretty much a very prominent concern for people. This is a quite xenophobic era that I'm talking about, sort of 1890 to about 1920, 1925. It was really a moment that the U.S. was very concerned about other religions. So, for example, a Chinese Exclusion Act definitely had to do with believing them to be Confucian, right? So, there was that concern. There was also religions within the U.S. that were concerned to sort of xenophobic. So like I said, the polygamist law was passed in 1892, and it was against Mormons who were coming in through Mexico. So, and it was to bar them from entering the U.S. So, I mean, if you take this sort of writ large, there were strong concerns against Catholics, even from Italy and from Ireland, even though at that point the Irish had lived in the U.S. for a longer time. And from Eastern Europe, you have Slavs, some of whom are Muslim, some of whom are Eastern Orthodox. Even the Eastern Orthodox, and that's what's sort of interesting to me when I'm reading this, were really considered outsiders. That there was a fear of Eastern Orthodox, not to the extent maybe of Muslims, but there were fears that a WASP nation was changing. So the quotas that I was just mentioning that were enacted were based on the 1890 census, which is a long time before 1924. And the reason they were picking that is because the Congress wanted the type of immigrants that came in 1890, who were traditionally Western, Northern Europeans. So that plays into your question about religion, because in fact religion was a factor in excluding people, and particularly Asians. I mean, I think that although I'm looking at MENAs, Asians really had it really rough. Yeah. In the back?
I was wondering whether the Martosian case in 1923, I believe, where the Armenians had to go through the black.
Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Right. That is mainstream Protestant. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was there any record of the impact of the Martosian?
Mm-hmm. So the question is, how did the Armenian racial prerequisite cases, in the one in 1920, impact the racial classifications of Syrians? And they did borrow a little bit from the Armenian success. So there were two cases. One was earlier, and then the one was in the 1920s. And the Armenians were very successful, right, in not having it come back. So they petitioned, and they were granted naturalization, and they became U.S. citizens through these cases. And it is similar to the MENA cases that I'm looking at, particularly Syrian Christian cases, because once again, their Christianity is not sort of accepted as being the norm, and the norm meaning a Protestant, vague Protestant norm, a WASP type of norm. And so as Eastern Christians, they also face discrimination on the same basis. I believe that they use the same anthropologist. So the anthropologist would go and look at where the peoples were and how that related to the Caucasus Mountains. So that actually kind of served the Armenians quite well, right? But there was also this proximity to the Caucasus Mountains that was also used, especially in the earlier cases, where biological origins were emphasized more. Yes?
How do you classify polygamy as a cultural issue or as a religious issue?
The question was, how do I classify polygamy as cultural or religious? I mean, I actually believe it's more cultural, not because, for a few reasons, I'll explain. There is no cases where there was actually a Muslim who was polygamist, right? So it's not the reality of being polygamist. It was the concept that Muslims could be polygamist because the religion permitted up to 4 wives. Well, this was the argument. And so I believe that it wasn't the practice of religion. I believe it was the perception of religion. And that's why I consider it more cultural. Now, they can go back to the Quran and say, oh, but it says this. It's based on a religious tenet, but there were no cases where there really was a Muslim who was polygamist who was turned away, right? So that's why I sort of think it's the way in which Islam was viewed from the outside rather than experienced within the U.S. Yeah, Musa.
I was wondering if there is any research, MENA American research done in the period following the fall of Granada and the arrival of Columbus to the Philadelphia exhibition.
The question was, is there research done between the Columbus and the 1876 Philadelphia World's Fair exhibition? There is some. There's a recent book by, I think it's Layla Lalami, and I forget the title now, on Zamora, who was a slave, who's brought as a slave from North Africa, but a very educated man. And I haven't read the book yet. But there's not that much research, I have to say. The only book that really has anything from this in it is Adele Eunice's book, which it's listed as the last reference here. And it would only be the first chapter or two. I would be very interested in reading something that was on that period, because what it does is it emphasizes the North African, which is something that's missing from the literature, and the experience of slaves, which is part of the experience of Menans in America, if we take it a bit more holistically. So, yeah, that would be interesting. Yes?
You mentioned in the very beginning something about the tab now being added for Middle Eastern Americans for the census about the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just curious, there's a big lumping still going on. It includes everything from, it seems, Central Asia and India to North Africa, with many different languages and what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see this becoming a problem because not all of them, it's assumed automatically that A, they're all Arab, B, they're all Muslim. And do you see this becoming an issue and sort of feeding into the craziness of lumping everyone into one little tight category, which is absolutely not correct?
Well, so the question is MENA too broad? Right, sort of. I think that race is problematic anyway. So I think all of them are too broad, if you want my honest opinion, there are plans to have categorizations that are underneath MENA. So especially with technology, you can add in Arab, or you can add in Armenian from Lebanon, or you can add in whatever you want. And I think that that's an important factor in showing that there's sub-identities after checking a box or not checking a box, right? And that's going to be the same for white. So you can check white and put in Lebanese if you wanted, or Armenian or whatever. Yeah, Mohammed.
Just a clarification. So in these set, initially in these, say the 1920s or earlier, would they actually ask you your religion? Would you have to clarify your religion? Or was that
In the census?
Or in your application for naturalization, for example, would you actually have
The question is religion included in the census, and is it included in the immigration records? So in the immigration records, no, it is not included. Although the immigration officers could ask, right? They could ask, but we don't have it written down. We don't know what was said, right?
So they would just assume that you were Muslim,
Well, they would ask in the question, like, where are you from and where are your papers from, right? So the papers would be from the Ottoman Empire, right? Or they wouldn't have papers. And actually, what's interesting, just as British subjects had to swear that they no longer had an allegiance to the British monarchy, the Ottoman subjects, when they became naturalized, had to swear that they did not have allegiance to the Ottoman Sultan. And so, but they would just cross out British and they would put in Ottoman. I mean, it wasn't a special form. So that shows that there's probably not enough to create a special form, but I think that that's sort of an interesting anecdote in terms of becoming naturalized. And in the census, There is some tracking of religion until World War II, when it ceases. Yeah. Mhm. Any more questions? Great. Well, thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate it.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.